ठीक है?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We are live right now. And
Sorry?
we are live right now, and we'll be starting in 5.
Okay, perfect. Also, is there anything that you would like me to cover in particular? Like कुछ भी अगर ऐसे acknowledgement या कुछ करना है IIIT को या anything?
Introduction तो I will cover.
ठीक है.
And also I आपको YouTube live chat का वो भेज रहा हूँ link. So like
Okay.
like side में if you can open the
Sure.
live for questions.
ठीक है, sorted. Got it. एक second.
Hello everyone. Good evening. It's time to go. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you for being part of with. Thank you for staying with us for the first 6 sessions. Now we are here with the 7th session. To be honest, if something excites me most about MUNs, it is crisis and crisis committees. So today the agenda is again how to handle crisis and committees, and in general, what are crisis committees. So today we have with us Mr. Shivang Singh. A few words about him. Mr. Shivang is a final year president scholar at the University of Hong Kong, pursuing his bachelor's in international business and global management with a second major in wealth management. He is currently completing a set of advanced courses in finance at the Harvard Summer School, while also working as a sales executive for an international distributor of medical supplies to help aid relief efforts towards the COVID-19 pandemic. After his graduation, Mr. Singh aspires to pursue higher studies in law and public policy with the ultimate aim of joining mainstream politics in India. He has already worked with a member of parliament in Lok Sabha and trained at the High Court of Himachal Pradesh in dedicated pursuit of the same. Again, many of you must be saying that how can I manage my academics and MUNs together? I have the biggest example for you, Shivang sir. A board stopper that is not even only in his school. He had an all India rank in his boards and is an inspiration for every one of us here. So, Shivang bhai, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Vinamr. These are very kind words, very humbling, and it's a pleasure to join you for this MUN training session. I hope that I'm able to be of help to the students who are joining in, because I think the idea is to learn and be able to develop the skills and the knowledge that is necessary to be able to succeed at a platform like MUNs. So the platform, of course, is wonderful because it gives us ample opportunities to be able to interact with people, to be able to network and make contacts for your life. And they're going to obviously help you in the future. And it's a mutual symbiotic relation, I would say. So that is my primary goal when it comes to MUNs, that I need to make friends, I need to learn from people, be able to interact with them. And it's great. I can see the YouTube chat. A lot of people are joining in. काफी complex हो रहा है because it's been a while since I did MUNs, but I hope I can still share my takeaways with you to be able to help you in basically determining how one should deal with crisis committees and everything related to that. So thank you again for the introduction. Very positive, very humbling. But I would like to make sure that all delegates and all future MUN aspirants over here are not intimidated by me in any way. I am one of you, right? I was sitting right there with you a few years back when I was trying to learn and train myself. And I'm sure a few years down the line, you yourselves will be sitting right here and passing the baton on to future MUN aspirants. So let's begin with the basics. As far as crisis committees are concerned, one very fine line of difference between conventional committees and crisis committees is the need for timely responsiveness and the need to be able to act on very short notice, very prompt, prodding from the executive board whenever there's an unexpected event that occurs or whenever there's any unforeseen problem that surfaces. So while in conventional committees, all of us have a standard set of research. All of us have what we call our opening statements or our general speakers list or our prepared speeches for moderated caucuses. All of that becomes slightly, I won't say irrelevant, but a little less useful in a crisis committee because you're basically on the spot at all times. So you have to be very impromptu. You have to go extempore with most of your speeches. And I'm very sorry, I have a terrible cold today ever since I woke up. So do excuse me. So anyway, one thing that everybody should keep in mind with crisis committees is that you need to be very attentive all the time. So you'll have regular updates that will be coming in. There will be a lot of communication from the executive board that you will have to take note of. And if this communication is undermined or disregarded in any way, then the flow of events or the chain that one needs to follow in a crisis committee essentially breaks and it is not possible to be able to perform effectively. So a crisis committee is very demanding. I think that is one thing that everybody should take note. That is one prerequisite that if you are coming to a conference to do a crisis committee, it will take up a lot of your time and you will obviously not have the time to go outside, chill with your friends, take selfies as most people prefer to do. But obviously, these days we're in a distance learning or an online format of Model UN. And I would say elements, negative elements like those are obviously uh, not present. But obviously, there are things that come in, there are things that go away. So that was just one heads up that I felt I should give all the delegates and all the aspirants. Coming specifically to how crisis committees are run, I feel one thing that delegates should note is that there is a lot of discretion of the executive board at play. So while conventional committees have a very set standard and rigid rule of procedure, crisis committees don't really follow a very rigid set of rules. It's very flexible. Obviously, this varies from executive board to executive board. I can obviously just talk about me personally as a chairperson of a crisis committee because I've done quite a few lately, especially Indian crisis committees, war cabinets, so to say. But that's one thing that everybody should keep in mind and be ready for. So you can't really be taken by surprise when you're going for a crisis committee कि भाई हमने प्रिपेयर तो ये किया था स्कूल में कि अच्छा पहले जनरल स्पीकर्स लिस्ट होगी, we'll have an opening statement of 90 seconds, POIs पूछे जाएंगे and फिर you know select topics पे हम लोग moderated caucuses से discussion करेंगे. That is fair. I mean, that is exactly how conventional committees function. But a crisis is supposed to take you by surprise. So another very interesting part about this is that in a lot of committees, when conventional debate is getting boring or monotonous or even redundant, so to say, students start asking, delegates start asking, ki, sir, please crisis do. And I would say that defeats the entire purpose of a crisis, because it is supposed to be unexpected and unforeseen. But that's fair. As far as being creative, innovative, and as far as being impromptu is concerned, I feel the delegates do have a right to demand any kind of crisis, just in case they're not feeling that the committee debate, the committee discussion is up to mark. Okay, I see that there's a comment on the YouTube chat saying, "Sir, kindly say slowly." So I think I'll just go a little slow. I'm very sorry if I was fast before this. Right. So I made this small, very brief presentation on what kinds of instruments we use in a crisis committee. So there's crisis notes or updates that you provide to the executive board individually. And then there's, of course, committee directives that the entire committee works towards and follows through with after having voted upon them. And that is basically enumerating certain actions that the committee would like to take towards the updates that the executive board is giving, right? So we'll come to the presentation later. But before that, uh, we can begin with a brief discussion of how a crisis committee can differ with the general committees that we have, the conventional committees. So as far as rules of procedure are concerned, one thing is the general speakers list that we take in conventional procedure sort of transforms into what we call a provisional speakers list. So let's say that the executive board throws out a crisis update that XYZ has happened in so and so location, and the matter is of utmost urgency and it needs to be taken up for discussion by the committee. So in such a case, you have multiple ways to be able to discuss such a crisis, right? The most common way is a provisional speakers list, which is very similar to a general speakers list, because delegates basically record their recognitions with the executive board, and then they get a set time to be able to give their speech, their views, their thoughts on the particular crisis that's been given, the update that's been given. And with that, they can even ask questions or be asked questions once they're through with their speeches under the provisional speakers list. Apart from that, another way of acquiring more information is to ask questions to the executive board. So usually, executive boards open the floor for, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and they are open to an indefinite number of questions from the delegates, just in case they would like to clarify some information, if they would like to seek some additional information, if they require any kinds of numbers, stats, figures, whatever. So if there is something that the executive board has, then it furnishes that information through the questions that delegates tend to ask. And then again, the third way is to have moderated caucus speeches. So the most common kind of moderated caucus suggestion is that the delegate of XYZ would like to propose a moderated caucus to discuss the crisis at hand or discuss the latest update. So this is how you can basically open the floor for discussion via a moderated caucus. Now, uh, while discussion can take place through these measures, we also have instruments such as crisis notes and committee directives, which I will just explain in a minute. So, what is the role of delegates in a crisis committee? It is very different from our role in a conventional committee, because in a conventional committee, the agenda is standard, it's set, and the scope of discussion on that agenda is also very well defined. So we can take topics individually, right? Subtopics under every agenda, and discuss those through moderated caucuses, through unmoderated caucuses, and take the committee forward. That's how we progress in a conventional committee. But in a crisis committee, what the executive board is particularly looking for is the adeptness of all the delegates in being able to construct the way forward for the committee. Because usually the agenda of a crisis committee is classified, or even if it is not classified, you will have only limited amount of information. You perhaps would not even get a background guide at times. So how you're basically in the committee waiting for instructions, and you have to be ready to build the road thereafter from there. So students who prefer to read, prepared speeches, or students who would like to prepare their material before being able to deliver it in committee would obviously perform better in conventional committees. But crisis committees, since they are very demanding and the nature is impromptu, as I mentioned, it is essential that delegates who have a knack for being able to be very alert and observant and be very, very innovative and creative on the spot, right? They are the ones who are able to perform best in crisis committees. And one way to go about this is having very strong research, because if your research is very strong, if you have everything on your tips, then you do not really need the time to go over your research documents or try to look up information on the internet. And you can really respond to the executive board with, say, a crisis note, or begin work towards a committee directive within moments of the crisis update coming to the floor. So that's why delegate qualities, delegate skills, all of this is extremely important, right? Now, coming to what I was talking about earlier, crisis notes and crisis updates, I'll quickly share my screen to you. I can see that there are a few questions on the YouTube chat, which I will come to in a while. But before that, allow me to share my screen and I will show you this very brief presentation that explains how a crisis note and how a committee directive needs to be and what their role in committee really is. Right. So I hope you can see my screen now. Yeah, I think you can.
Yes, it is visible. Also, here, can you just once tell what is a crisis committee? Like multiple times the same question is being asked. What is a crisis
Oh, okay,
committee in
sure.
brief?
Sure. I did explain this very briefly, but I can elaborate. So a crisis committee is particularly a committee that that can have a timeline setting that is historic, current, as well as futuristic. And it's a very fictitious kind of committee, so to say. So in conventional committees, there is a set mandate that the UN body really has, whether it's the United Nations General Assembly or whether it's the Security Council or even the WHO for that matter. There are a lot of organizations, not only with the UN but independent, so to say, who that can basically function on a set roadmap. But a crisis committee essentially is a very specialized kind of committee wherein roles of all members may not be very well defined, wherein the mandate of the committee itself may not be very well defined. And again, it may be as well. So we don't take that at face value or as a prerequisite, but essentially you're basically required to entertain an unexpected or a fictitious kind of a scenario. So let me give you an example. I was in SRCC MUN 2 years back, and we were in the Indian War Cabinet for 1971, which was basically the Bangladesh Liberation War. And there were a lot of scenarios that were thrown to all the delegates by the executive board that in reality did not really exist, right? So the real timeline was very different. But in the crisis committee that we were simulating, the scenarios that were being given and the updates that were being given were very different. So a crisis committee can deviate from real timelines or real occurrence of events. That is what a crisis committee basically is. And as the name suggests, a crisis is unexpected. These are a few keywords that I've been using since the very beginning. So whenever you're taken by surprise on any kind of event, which is either related or even unrelated to the agenda of the committee, that is a crisis. And committees that function exclusively on updates and not a central agenda basically can be termed to be crisis committees. So I hope that clears it out for everybody who's been inquiring on the YouTube chat. But now, as you can see my screen, let me just share this to you. Okay. So a crisis note, right? What is a crisis note? It's an individual suggestion for an update. All delegates are required to engage in the process of taking the committee forward such that they can create scenarios of their own and recommend them to the executive board. So every individual can basically integrate the powers of their portfolio. So let's say there's a certain health minister in a committee. Let's say there's a certain defense minister in a committee. So these people can particularly use their portfolio powers to make certain suggestions or recommendations. Like if we're simulating, let's say, a committee that has been constituted by the government of India, right? That is trying to discuss the COVID-19 crisis, then the Minister of Health can use crisis notes to sort of communicate with the executive board and update them of certain events and occurrences that that particular delegate would like to see discussed in the committee. Now, it is obviously at the discretion of the executive board whether they would like to accept that crisis note or not. So if the executive board chooses to accept the crisis note, then in that case, um, the tangent of events keeps changing. So let's say I made a recommendation that became an update from the executive board. And in response to that update, or in addition to that, another delegate suggests something through a crisis note, something that is supplementary, something that is complementary. Uh, and if that is also accepted by the executive board, then that gets added to the tangent of events. So the delegates are basically creating scenarios themselves. And it's just that the executive board obviously has the discretion to accept the suggestions of these delegates, maybe alter them, modify them to some extent, and also keep communicating with them confidentially, because there may be some matters that delegates would like to discuss with the executive board confidentially without letting the entire committee know. All of this obviously depends on your extent of creativity and being able to sort of lead and direct the committee. But again, it is a provision that you have. So going through the points once again, you have individual suggestions for updates, right? There's integration of portfolio powers. So very portfolio specific suggestions can be given, because if you look at it, you are the only ones in a position of authority or in a position that's commanding enough to be able to give updates in that particular domain. So the way you write your crisis notes and make recommendations to the executive board in terms of what subsequent updates should look like, all of that, if it's very detailed in terms of what your portfolio ambit entails, then you're obviously using your crisis notes effectively. As I mentioned, it's confidential communication with with the executive board. You may choose to bring it on public record. You can let the others know as well, but it can also stay completely secret between you and the executive board. Then it may or may not be disclosed in committee by the executive board. They may accept your update, but they also may reject it, because if they feel that the tangent of events should be different, or your recommendation is not up to par because it's missing certain elements, which I will just come to, then it can obviously be rejected. And finally, it is ruled by discretion. So the executive board has the final word. No matter how keen delegates are for a particular crisis note to be released in committee, uh, the executive board will hold the final word. Now, what all should a crisis note have? What are the elements, what are the aspects of a crisis note that should be covered by every delegate? Now, you can list them in these 6 questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. Let's take an example. So, this is a sample crisis note. I've tried to take information from various sources that are available on the net. So you can actually go to YouTube or go to various educational websites that provide MUN resources and MUN material and find similar things over there. So this is a very generic, very basic example. Obviously, this is not something that you would usually see in a crisis committee because of how simple and how not very controversial it is. But let's just go over it once. So the crisis note reads: to my secretary Dougie, I'm in need of a new phone. I need it to be a smartphone capable of email, internet access, texting, calling, Snapchat, XYZ. This will be a second phone for business purposes, so make sure it has a number that is different from my personal cell and sign it up under the company's name instead of my own. Since it is for business, use the corporate card to pay for it. Please acquire it as soon as you can. Feel free to leave it in my office once you get it. Thank you. And then the designation or the salutation of the person, which is John Johnson, CFO of Business Corp. So this is a sample crisis note, and it very perfectly addresses all the elements that I was talking about. So the first element is who, right? So you have to specify in a crisis note who you're writing that note to. It can be to a fellow delegate, but it is usually given to the executive board, right? And basically, while you're giving the chit to the executive board, whoever the crisis note is directed to is the who over here. So you can pass on a crisis note to the executive board as the Minister of Health and address it to the health secretary. So that's what who covers, right? Next is what. So be very specific and be very clear with what the content of that crisis note is. What do you want to use it for? That is what the what aspect of it covers. So he basically gives some specifics, very detailed specifics, that the smartphone should be capable of emailing and internet access and texting and Snapchat. So basically trying to give certain descriptive and elaborate additions to whatever you're asking for. Then there's when, right? So when do you need it by? It's pretty simple over here. Please acquire it as soon as you can. So there's no fixed timeline, but it has been put on an ASAP approach. So he's basically directed his secretary to acquire the phone as soon as possible, right? Then there's where. So whatever you're asking that person to do, if it is to procure something, or if it is to deliver something, or if it is to meet somewhere, or if it is to send some people somewhere. Let's say if you want to send spies to another country, very generic example, but that is what where will entail. That where are you actually sending or targeting the content of your crisis note. Then there's how. So over here, he's basically directing the secretary to use the corporate card to pay for it. And then finally, there's a why, wherein you briefly explain what the purpose of the crisis note is, right? What the purpose is, or what your intention is, what you would like to accomplish through the crisis note. So this is what a holistic, all-rounded crisis note looks like. It has all elements. It is sufficiently detailed, but not very, very wordy. It doesn't need to be an entire page of a notepad. It can simply be half a page or even the size of a chit pad, as long as it is covering all the details that I have mentioned. But are crisis notes enough or sufficient to be able to take the committee forward? Obviously not, because ultimately they just represent an individual contribution that you are making, correct? So a crisis note is limited to your role, it is limited to your portfolio, and you may choose to share it with others, but it will obviously not have the same effect as a committee directive. And what is the main point of difference between these two? A crisis note is accepted at the discretion of the executive board. But if you can see the last point here, committee directives usually need to be ruled on by voting. So just as you have draft resolutions or working papers in a conventional committee, what you can use in a crisis committee is a committee directive, and there can be multiple committee directives. So mind you, while a draft resolution is usually towards the end of the committee, right? Let's say if it's a 2-day committee, then at the very end you will have a draft resolution or maybe multiple draft resolutions, but only one of them will obviously be passed. And when you have a draft resolution that passes, other draft resolutions don't even need to be taken up for voting. So, on the contrary, committee directives are very perpetual in nature. They are not limited to just being, at the end of the committee. They will be required at the end of every update, so to say. So, let's say the committee is given an update by the executive board that there is some kind of terrorist activity that has been spotted around the Delhi Vidhan Sabha premises. So, and the committee that is being simulated is the National Security Council. I'm just taking very vivid examples to be able to explain the concept better to you. So, what the committee would essentially need to do is immediately discuss the crisis, and right after that, come up with a committee directive that sort of enumerates the steps that certain relevant agencies should now take in order to curtail the crisis, basically solve it. So, if it's the National Security Council, it can maybe delegate certain responsibilities to the CRPF that, okay, let us cordon off a radius of half a kilometer or 1 kilometer from the Delhi Vidhan Sabha, that no traffic will be allowed to get into that radius, no traffic will be allowed to step out of that radius. Then there can be additional responsibilities that are delegated to other agencies. So let's say that the defense secretary proposes we should put a certain regiment of the army, or let's say the National Security Guard, right, the NSG, on standby. So any kind of recommendation, it just needs to be listed, and it needs to be very specific to the update that's been given. So the committee directive is essentially a way to address the update, and there will be multiple committee directives just as there are multiple updates. So what are the salient features of a committee directive? First, committee suggestions for action on updates. What did we see earlier? From a crisis notes perspective, it was basically an individual suggestion for an update. So you are basically trying to induce the executive board to accept your update and release it in committee so that it can be used to pave the way forward. Whereas a committee directive is an action on that update. It is basically trying to outline steps that we should take there and then to be able to handle the crisis. Second, instead of integration of purely your portfolio powers, as we had seen in the case of crisis notes, you need to integrate adequate lobbying and diplomacy. Because to address one update, let's say update 1.0, there can be multiple points of view, correct? And there can be multiple approaches that certain delegates are willing to take. And there will be conflict of interests, there will be conflict of opinions. So, in a state like this, it is very essential that you have to handle the crisis, but at the same time, it needs to be with the consensus of most committee members, provided you have a majority, so to say. So, that is why your lobbying, your diplomacy, your ability to network with fellow delegates, your ability to convince them that the points that you are making are cogent, are the ones that should be taken, and also trying to give them room to make suggestions, recommendations, and additions of their own. That is how an effective delegate can handle a crisis and a committee directive in turn effectively. Third salient feature, it's on record communication with the executive board. So all all committee directives that are submitted to the executive board will be read out in committee. They are public information because ultimately all delegates need to vote. So let's say the executive board receives three crisis committee directives. I apologize. So if they've received three directives, they will read all three out to the delegates so that they can make an informed decision as to which directive is checking all the boxes or most boxes, right? Is it countering the problem effectively? Is it proposing to have adequate standby or reserve or backup measures? Is it taking all aspects into accounts, whether let's say with the example that we have just taken, is it taking security and safety of the people in the Delhi Legislative Assembly into consideration? Is it taking the safety and security of the people around the premises, right? Whether it's residences, whether it's commercial outlets, people in these areas, are they being taken care of through that committee directive? So there are a lot of things that need to be considered. So make sure that whatever committee directives you make are very detailed, are extremely all-rounded. They should sufficiently cater to or address all kinds of matters that have been brought up in the update that was given. And then there may be a requirement by the executive board that a committee directive needs to have a minimum number of sponsors or a minimum number of signatories or both. So the committee chair will obviously inform all the delegates about this at the very beginning or whenever there is any scope to bring in a committee directive. So these are obviously rules of procedure that vary from committee to committee. I personally, as a chairperson, just sometimes make a requirement of say two sponsors for a committee directive, no signatories. You can bring it in. We will read it out in committee, and then delegates can take their informed decision as to which committee directive they would like to choose. But then you also may have some chairs who are a little more stern about it. So they would like to see that you have more support and more seconds in the form of signatories. So let's say there are two sponsors who have contributed majorly to the committee directive. And then in addition to that, you have, let's say, another five delegates who are supporting whatever is enumerated in the committee directive. So then they turn out to be signatories. So whatever the prerequisites are, you will have to take note of those whenever you go to committee. Just make sure that you're able to use your diplomacy to be able to acquire those numbers. Because if you're not, then you're essentially not being able to table the committee directive. And if it is not coming on the table, then it will not be voted upon. And obviously, in crisis committees, you need to be aware that awards or performance, so to say, is determined by your proactiveness with crisis notes as well as committee directives. So if you're only proactive in one of them, let's say you're very proactive in sending crisis notes, which is basically updates to the executive board. So, okay, you're managing, you're doing a good job trying to construct the crisis further. You're adding elements onto it that are relevant. But if you are failing to bring in even one committee directive, or if your committee directives are deficient in number as well as in quality relatively to other committee directives, then you may not be a very strong contender for awards. Similarly, if there is a certain delegate who is performing fantastically with committee directives by sending in multiple steps, multiple suggestions on what action needs to be taken on the update, then obviously he's being very attentive or she's being very attentive and is being able to answer those relevant questions using their research. But if they're not sending in any crisis notes, aka not really adding to the crisis elements of the committee, then again it will not really reflect very well on their marking. So the ideal delegate or the best delegate, as we would like to call it, will be that delegate who is able to bring about a balance of the two is able to send in sufficient good quality committee directives as well as sufficient good quality crisis notes. So this is one thing that you should all take note of, that the performance needs to be very well managed, very balanced, and it cannot only lean towards one aspect. Like in conventional committees, there is adequate emphasis that is given to verbal speeches as it is given to chits, depending on the ratio of marking or depending on the strength of the committee. Similarly, committee directives as well as crisis notes happen to have a very, very strong presence and influence in crisis committees. So you can't solely rely on only your verbal speeches either. You will have to, again, maintain a balance between speeches as well as the time and the effort that you are allocating to constructing crisis notes and formulating committee directives. So keep that in mind. We can take a sample of a committee directive into consideration. Again, this is pretty casual and not very relevant to MUNs, but it's still a decent example to explain the concept to you. So the title is Space Jam. Since our astronauts have trouble getting enough servings of fruit in space, we here at NASA will provide them with a new food option, which is Space Jam. Space Jam will be developed by XYZ. The flavors provided will include XYZ. One serving of Space Jam will be provided XYZ, and so on. So you can read the sample by yourselves. But what I'm trying to highlight here is the elements that have been taken into account. First is the who. Again, 6 elements: who, what, where, when, how, and why. So, who? It is basically mentioning certain officials who are relevant to this particular committee directive, or is mentioning, another official, or certain agencies can also be mentioned that are relevant to this particular committee directive. Second, what? Obviously, it's a committee directive, so you will have to you know be very specific about what the agenda or what the intention of this committee directive is. So mention that, as you can see in the red underlines. Then there's when. Again, there's no well-defined or no specific timeline over here, but it is mentioned that the project is a top priority project. So again, on an ASAP basis, as soon as possible. Then there is where. So it will be worked on in our Florida-based laboratories. There's how, give a certain description of how you intend to implement or enforce what you're proposing in the committee directive. And then finally, there's a why, because a committee directive is only as good as its purpose. If there is no purpose, or if the purpose is vague, if it is ambiguous, then it is not a very strong committee directive. As you can see over here, this directive is very specific. It is talking categorically about fruits, servings of fruit in space for its astronauts. So it's a very particular issue that's come to light and has been addressed. So that's pretty much what I had as far as crisis notes and committee updates or committee directives were concerned. Let me just stop my sharing now. Give me a minute. Okay. Vinamr, am I still audible? I hope there's no technical
Yeah,
issue.
you're audible. Now we can shift towards the Q&A.
ठीक है.
There are multiple questions, so you can find them in the
Perfect.
chat.
All right. So now I will have a look of the questions that all members, all participants have been putting up on our
So if you
YouTube
can,
chat.
give a bit, thoda sa, like MUN kind of example for crisis, like what a crisis committee in an MUN and what can it have as a crisis, which would clear up
Okay,
things.
sure, sure. So let's say a lot of conventional committees center on the debate around ISIS, or terrorist funding or terrorist movement in Middle Eastern regions, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria. So a crisis can simply be that there has been some kind of assassination of a big leader by these outfits, and the committee may be required to respond to such a situation. There can be elements of a certain very reputed official's relative getting kidnapped, and the terrorist outfits that are in question are obviously placing some demands that they would like met, and the committee has the responsibility of discussing how negotiations with these kidnappers need to take place. So there's a multitude of crisis possibilities. The very fact that it's a crisis clearly shows that it can have any far reaching implications. It can include absolutely anything under the sun. And obviously, it will be related to the agenda that you're discussing to some extent. But at times when the agenda has somewhat exhausted and does not have much more scope for discussion, the executive board may also introduce some kind of crisis that is relevant to the committee, if not the agenda. So obviously, it will depend on the mandate of the committee as well. So if there's any particular case scenario that you would like to discuss, we can take it up in the video in the YouTube chat as well. But let me go over other kinds of questions that I'm coming across. What is crisis? So everybody in the initial phase of this webinar had very simple questions that what is a crisis? And I can repeat that for you. It's something that is unexpected. It is a situation or a scenario that is given to delegates, and they are entrusted with the responsibility of dealing with it, solving it, coming up with recommendations on how it should be tackled. So if you want to take real life examples, I mentioned a kidnapping, right? So back in, I think, 1990 or even slightly after that, the then Home Minister's daughter, Mr. Mufti was the Home Minister at the time, and his daughter got kidnapped, and in return, Masood Azhar and a few more terrorists were basically asked, the government was asked to release them, right? So this is somewhat of a crisis scenario that the daughter of a very top official has been kidnapped. Her safety is the priority of the government, but at the same time, the government also needs to weigh the importance of keeping a prisoner or a terrorist as ferocious or as wanted, as guilty as whoever they were asking to release, uh, behind bars. Because just because there's been a certain kidnapping doesn't mean that the government will release terrorists on demand. So how delegates can discuss this scenario, there will be opposition between thoughts. So there will be one school of thought that will say yes, we should release these terrorists unconditionally so that we are able to get back Mr. Mufti's daughter. Second school of thought can be that there should be a no negotiation policy with terrorists, which means that they can do whatever they would like to, but we are not going to cave in or give in to their demands, right? And there can be a third school of thought, multiple for that matter, but a third school of thought that says that, okay, let us take some time to discuss this a little further and maybe reach a mean. So for students who are pursuing law, something called ADR, alternate dispute resolution, right? Which is not in extremes, not black and white. You try to meet midway. You try to find some kind of middle ground where you can negotiate with stakeholders and act accordingly. So a third school of thought can say कि अच्छा भाई ऐसा है, ये बहुत ज़्यादा गिल्टी टेररिस्ट है, इसको हम नहीं छोड़ सकते, लेकिन क्योंकि मुफ्ती जी की बेटी की भी सुरक्षा काफ़ी इम्पोर्टेंट है, we will try and come up with other ways to pacify the terrorists. So this is again, there's a multitude of approaches that you can take towards these various scenarios. So that's what a crisis is. I hope this example has been able to explain the concept in detail. Hanji Vinamra, batao.
Can you take now answer like what is a portfolio? Like in simple words. like
Sure,
really quickly.
sure.
Last.
ठीक है. What is a portfolio? Portfolio is nothing but your designation in committee, your role in committee. That is what a portfolio is. This is not finance. We're not talking about investment portfolios here. This is just simply the role that has been given to you. जिस तरह एक conventional committee में आपके पास हो सकता है country की portfolio हो. You will have the delegate of Argentina, you will have the delegate of Pakistan, you will have the delegate of Russia. So these countries are their portfolios. But when it comes to non-international committees, like let's say a national committee, or let's say a committee that has only certain designations of people, then obviously their portfolio will not be on the basis of a country. So you won't have delegate of Argentina or delegate of Pakistan. What you will have is members of that committee. So there can be a secretary for research, there can be a secretary for outreach, there can be the chief of army staff, we can have a member of legislative assembly. It can be very, very diverse. So these portfolios are nothing but your role or your designation in the committee, and they have certain responsibilities that define that role. So the chairman of the Niti Aayog has certain responsibilities that define his role, and that is his portfolio. So I hope that's clear. The portfolio can be a prime minister's portfolio. The portfolio can be a defense minister's portfolio, or the portfolio can also be, a member or a legal advisor in some international organization. Let's say there's a simulation of Amnesty International, or any other kind of international organization. In cases like those, members basically have a very individual role to play. They're not representing any one particular country. They are not representing any one particular department, so to say. They're probably representing a school of thought. So various panelists may be there, and that is what a portfolio is. Okay. What is a position paper in a crisis committee? Someone has mentioned this, Lakshmi Priya. Well, to be honest, position papers are a thing of the past these days. Position papers are basically uh, documents that sort of outline uh, the relevance of the agenda to your particular portfolio, whether that's your country, whether that's your department, whatever. And it tries to throw light on certain aspects, such as what is your country's take on the agenda, what have you already done. Let's say if you're discussing rights of women and children in situations of war in the Middle East or in Africa, because of the Rwandan genocide or other such atrocities that have occurred. So, if you're discussing rights of children, rights of women, and there are various countries of the African Union that have come together, so your position paper will basically entail a brief of everything that your country can is in a position to say on the agenda, right? And you can obviously throw light on some actions that you have taken. Uganda can say, well, we've made fast track courts for victims of organized crime or victims of rape in war. So, stuff like that. But in a crisis committee, particularly, position papers are not required. I personally haven't quite seen these. But again, it depends on the discretion of the executive board. So, if the executive board feels that the agenda is slightly vague or slightly ambiguous, and if he or she feels the need to establish some kind of clarity as to how each member of the committee is related to the agenda, then they may ask for position papers. So, in such an event, you would submit position papers just to let the executive board know whether you are in favor of the agenda being discussed, whether you're against the agenda being discussed, or whether you are neutral to it or have some kind of a third front, fourth front stance. Okay. So that is what a position paper is, and it is usually not required in crisis committees. But if it is barely it's not very different from how you have position papers in conventional committees. What does it mean, a 0-hour discussion practice? Aditya has asked this question. I'm not very sure if this is indicative of the 0-hour in Lok Sabha, but
Shivang भैया,
हाँ जी.
आप ना थोड़ा like chat में थोड़ा पीछे चल रहे हो, so like if you know you can scroll down to
Okay, cool. I will do that. Is WHO a crisis committee? See, any committee can be a crisis committee as long as there is introduction of new updates. अगर आप एक agenda के हिसाब से चल रहे हो, if you have one set agenda and you are just discussing that from various views, then it is a conventional committee. But the moment there is any element of an update, something that is unexpected, it becomes a crisis committee. But again, you can't really separate them कि भाई ये crisis committee है ये नहीं है, unless it is so specified by the secretariat of the conference. So there can be some committees that are purely crisis also, and those are the ones that are traditionally called crisis committees. Okay, is this note a portfolio? Okay, I'll skip that. EB is the secretary. Okay, there's some kind of confusion where delegates are asking who is secretary in MUN. I was just giving very generic examples. I was using examples to explain the concept to you. So I think I had mentioned health secretary or people of the sort. But these are just examples. You don't have to have a secretary in a committee. The portfolios can differ and they vary according to the kind of committee that it is and the kind of agenda that you're discussing. What is the aim of crisis note? Please explain as you are on that topic. Okay, so the crisis note, as I explained, is the aim of a crisis note is to make a personal recommendation to the executive board कि अच्छा अभी तक executive board ने बताया है that so and so things have occurred, that Mr. Mufti's daughter has been kidnapped. So suddenly, in order to construct this crisis further, what one delegate can do is, if he's say the defense minister, or if he's the director general of the CRPF, what he can quickly do is write another crisis note making a suggestion that these terrorists have been spotted in so and so area of Jammu and Kashmir, or in so and so area of POK, or whatever. Basically, again, it's fictitious. You can have any number of recommendations, you can have any kind of recommendations. It is very subjective. There is no concrete way to be able to deal with the crisis committee. See, since the very beginning of this webinar, I have been using examples. So don't take these examples as firm elements in a crisis committee, because that's not what it is. These are purely examples. They will differ from committee to committee. So the crisis note is essentially making a recommendation to the executive board that we would like to, see this occur after what update you've already given. Okay. Committee directive is EB. I mean, you direct the committee directive to the EV. Ujasvi Jain has asked this question. So again, a committee directive is basically trying to gather the support of all the delegates in committee and basically pitching or suggesting certain actionable steps to the executive board that will be taken towards the update that has been given. So that is what a committee directive is. Is a committee directive something similar to a draft resolution? Yes, indeed. As I mentioned, a draft resolution is usually required at the end of a committee when there is, ample discussion that's been done and there is no more room for discussion, and you have to come to some kind of a closing point or a conclusion or a resolution. that is when you get in a draft resolution. So the committee directive also has exactly the same agenda, but it takes very, very specific topics in isolation and tries to address them. And there will be multiple committee directives that delegates will have to uh, formulate in committee to be able to deal with each new update. If there is one update, then maybe one committee directive is sufficient. If there are multiple updates that are coming, very frequently, let's say every hour, every 2 hours, then you will have to come up with multiple directives to be able to counter each and every update. And one more thing that I probably forgot to mention was that because it's a crisis committee, the timeline will be very different from our real life timeline. So today, it's Wednesday and it's 6 p.m. right now. But if you're sitting in committee right now, it's possible that the crisis is taking place on 31st August at 4 p.m., right? And then suddenly you jump 6 hours and you go to 10 p.m. and there's another event that's occurred. And then it's possible you go even further than 2nd September. So you have to completely disregard your real timeline. You have to completely disregard your role as Shivang or as Vinamra. You are completely in the shoes of the member or the portfolio that you have been allocated. So whatever it can be a country, it can be a designation. You're basically a representative of your portfolio, and you have to act on the basis of the timeline that has been given by the executive board. It can also be a very historic timeline, not just a few days in difference, but maybe a few years. So a timeline in 1971. And it is possible that a committee of 30 delegates covers a timeline of, say, 30, 40 days or maybe a year in just 2 to 3 days of the conference. That is because of the very dynamic nature of a crisis committee. You are constantly getting updates, you are constantly responding through them, and that's how you move forward. What is the difference between committee directive and crisis note? I'll just mention that once finally because we've gone over this very repetitively. Crisis note is suggesting an update to the executive board कि सर हम चाहते हैं कि अभी आपने बोला है XYZ तो हम चाहते हैं आप इसमें ABC ऐड कर दो. That is a crisis note. Committee directive is सर अभी आपने बताया हमें XYZ घटा है. Now in order to address that problem or in order to tackle that problem, this is what we propose. It is a directive. We are directing the committee to take these steps. Whereas a crisis note is just an update. It's a note कि अब ये होना चाहिए. And it may be rejected by the executive board. It may be accepted. That is purely at discretion. Okay, let's move on. Is MUN something like debate? I think there are quite a few students over here who are very new to the concept of MUN. So I would encourage all of you to go over the previous sessions that Vinamra and his team have put together with various other dignified people from the circuit, Akshat, Weber. So all of these people have already given very cogent points on how MUNs function, what MUNs are. If you can go through those, you'll obviously be in a very better position to answer these questions yourself. Okay, I think we're reaching the end. Maybe another 5 to 7 minutes and we'll wrap up. And our number, is that all right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ashmita. This is very informative. I hope that this information has been able to, give you some kind of insight into the functioning of crisis committees. Yes, Ayan Mudra. Oh, Ayan has very perfectly put this into a short sentence about what a portfolio is. A portfolio basically means a country, organization, or any individual that you represent. So basically, your designation or your allocation in the committee. Okay, so there is one question where So earlier there was a question asking whether WHO is a crisis committee or not, and there's a spectator who's asked that why is WHO not a crisis committee, because it's handling the COVID crisis. See, that's what I'm saying. Any committee can go into a mode of crisis. जरूरी नहीं होता है that it needs to be defined as a crisis committee from the very beginning. That is also possible. So let's take three options. First option is there is a committee that the secretariat of the conference tells you is a crisis committee. So it is basically a crisis committee. That's something that they've said, which means it will regularly operate on updates and committee directives. Then the second scenario is that it is a regular committee like the WHO, and suddenly there is something that has occurred relevant to the committee or relevant to the members in the committee that is of crisis nature, which such as the COVID-19 crisis. Let's say it's 22nd March and 2020, 22nd March 2020, and the WHO has suddenly been given a lot of information on how deadly the COVID virus is and how communicable it is, and it's spreading with a lot of speed. And from there, the sequence of events so occurs that the whole financial system in the world crashes. There's a stock market crash in the US, which obviously has a domino effect on various crashes across the globe. So this becomes a crisis by itself. Within a few hours, within a couple of days, it becomes a crisis. So even though the WHO handles matters according to its mandate or according to its set, um, there's a particular term for it. Basically, the points that need to be taken up for discussion in every meeting are already formulated before the meeting. But it is possible that there is some additional topic that just happens to pop up, happens to come by, which is a crisis. So that is a crisis, the second option. And the third option is a conventional committee where you don't have any kind of crisis that's introduced. You simply go by the agenda that's given. The background guide already gives you a very fantastic base to what all the executive board would like to see discussed in committee, and you function according to that. So WHO is not a crisis committee. There is no crisis, no committee in this world, no committee can be termed a crisis committee unless obviously it is being simulated like that in a conference. All committees are regular committees. It can be a national committee in a certain country. It can be an international committee with organizations like the UN. But you can't call them a crisis committee. They're just committees. They handle crisis from time to time. And when these crises are simulated at a conference, then you can call those a crisis committee. So I hope that clarifies this question.
We have put a question in the chat box. If you can
Uh-huh.
answer that one, it has been answered by Babar.
Can you read it out for me?
What is the purpose of crisis notes and committee directives?
Okay, so I'll repeat that. Crisis notes have a very, very simple purpose, which is to add to the crisis updates that the executive board is giving, right? So let's say that the executive board in a WHO gives a crisis that we have, our scientists have come across evidence that the COVID virus is mutating. And this is going to be extremely problematic because the vaccinations that are under development are being made specifically for the strain of the virus that was first detected or the samples of which were first acquired, right? Now, this is a crisis. So what you can do is you can first ask the executive board questions to be able to get more information about this particular update. That one question can be that, sir, how many strains have been identified, or how frequently does the virus mutate, or this mutated virus, how many countries has it started impacting, or how many people has it impacted? These are various questions that you can ask the executive board. If they have information, they will give it to you. If they don't have information, they will say that this is something we will let you know in due process of time. So that is how you interact with the executive board. Now, with this, you can give a crisis note that adds to what the update has been. Let's say you are the Minister of Health for Finland, right? And you are a member of this particular committee of the WHO that is being simulated. So you can maybe write a crisis note to the executive board saying that, sir, my country has detected this particular strain, or maybe a range of strains of the virus, and scientists have published a report in some reputed journal saying that this is impacting so many people, or has so and so risks. So this is a crisis note. Now, when you send this to the executive board, he or she will see whether it is answering the what, when, where, who, why, and how questions. Is it a detailed enough crisis note, right? Can it give some direction to the committee? Can it add to the committee discussion in any way? So if they see that yes, there's a lot of potential and this is a very good update to give, they will simply accept it. They will let you know and they will release it in committee saying that we have just been updated by the health minister of Finland that XYZ has happened or is happening. So that is the crisis note. The purpose is to exploit and capitalize on your portfolio powers to be able to add to the committee crisis, correct? Second is committee directives. Now, in response to such an update from the Minister of Health Minister of Finland, the whole committee can take a provisional speakers list, can take a moderated caucus, or can have some other kind of provision that the executive board so allows to discuss the crisis. And once they've discussed it, they can use backroom negotiations or unmoderated caucuses, or breaks in committee to lobby, to network with delegates, to build support for some points that they've been able to make. And you're basically trying to list down just in numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers. You're listing what steps you would like to take towards this virus mutation issue that has come to light. So that is a committee directive, and it will have to be voted upon. There can be multiple committee directives. There can be 3 directives that are addressing the same issue of mutation, right? But only one of them needs to be passed. So let's say, so all 3 will be read out. They can be voted upon in the sequence that they were received from the delegates. They can be voted upon at the discretion of the executive board, seeing which one is more all-rounded, is more all-encompassing, right? So once that process is defined, and if the committee directive passes, then you have, in a way, रिजॉल्व्ड पार्ट ऑफ द इशू कि अच्छा कोविड क्राइसिस चल रही है, म्यूटेशन का इशू सामने आया था क्राइसिस नोट के जरिए, और कमिटी डायरेक्टिव को यूज करके हमने इस म्यूटेशन के इशू को एड्रेस कर दिया है. So then you move on to the next step. The committee can be given a new crisis from the executive board. The executive board can give a very fresh crisis saying that, okay, the COVID crisis has stimulated a lot of business shutdowns, right? And that is leading to a very grave economic detrimental impact for the entire world. So what is it that the committee can do to handle this? Then again, some delegate can put in a crisis note saying that, sir, my country has been harmed or damaged to this extent. And if the EB feels that it is a good crisis note, they will entertain it, they will release it in committee. Then there can be subsequent discussions, and then you can have a committee directive that is aimed particularly at the economic implications of the COVID crisis. So this is the flow of events. I'm basically trying to show you the flow of events, and that is how you will use crisis notes and committee directives. So I hope that that was a sufficient answer, Vinamraji.
Yes, Anji. So now, now we can end with this. So thank
Works.
you so much, Shivang Bhai, for coming and doing this. It is really an honor to have you address the gathering. And thank you everyone for staying with us. Next session is on 4th September. We'll be now specifically discussing about what are the actual committees in the United Nations and how do you participate in them and how you win in them. Till then, feel free to message us for all your doubts and feedbacks. Our numbers and social media handles are being communicated to you. And at the end, thank you so much, Shivang Bhai, for doing this.
It was completely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me over. I hope that I have been able to use my experience and my personal takeaways to add to the knowledge of everybody who's watching us. And
Really
a
do.
personal input that I would like to give to the others is that please use this platform to add to your knowledge, because Vinamra and his team, they are doing a fantastic job trying to aggregate so much relevant information in times like these when you don't have access to in-person MUN conferences. So please capitalize on this. Go over his videos. Try to interact with him. Ask him questions if you have to. Get in touch with the team and keep rolling. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye, everybody.
सार्थक
हाँ एक बार वहाँ पे बंद हो जाए फिर मैं एंड कर दूंगा, वो लैग होता है ना थोड़ा सा।
हाँ yeah